Right, hi everyone, I'm Colin from Argus. I'm the head of steel for the company, which is a much grander title than I deserve. We've got offices all over the show. We've got about 1,400 staff, I guess, but I won't bore you with that. So I'm going to talk about the drivers of the hot rolled coil market in general. I'm going to kind of zoom out from the UK, because I think most people who trade hot rolled in the UK probably know more about it than I do. So I'm going to take a broader brush approach. Now, the main problem for the hot rolled market, apart from the lack of demand that we've seen over the last months, is the amount of supply that's coming out of Asia. So if you think back to 2015, 2016, when China was exporting maybe 112, 115 million tons of steel a year, which was more than Japan produced at the time. And Japan was the second large steelmaker in the world at the time. It's now exporting more hot rolled coil than it did back then. So last year, China exported something like 24 million tons of hot rolled. A lot of that goes into the regional ASEAN market, so 6 million tons or so went to Vietnam. And that trend, which exports really jumped around August of last year as domestic demand came off. And exports as a share of production have moved up from kind of 5% to 10%, and that trend hasn't really stopped. So this year, China's exported an awful lot of hot rolled again, something like 15 million tons, I think, over the first 3 months, maybe slightly off. And Vietnam, which imported 6 million tons last year, has already imported more than half of that over the first 3 months of the year. So you just have this, and you can see on this chart, so this is the 2023 volume bubble, and this is 2015. So you can just basically see that exports to everywhere have ballooned, and this is specifically hot rolled. So what you're seeing is countries like Saudi Arabia, which never really exported anything into Europe, or maybe, every now and again, it's now quite a regular seller. Every month you're getting Hadid in the market to sell into Europe. You're getting Krakatau in Indonesia, who was never really a factor in the European market. They're selling into Europe as well. The big one, obviously, which I keep referring to, is Vietnam. So if you think back to 2020, 2021, Vietnam was probably selling something like 200,000 tons of hot rolled into the EU, maybe 300,000. Now that's 1 million plus, and it's the same for Japan and other big Asian exporters. So you've just seen this. China's dumping steel into the local markets. So you just have this kind of, whack-a-mole or diversion effect where everyone who's been subject to Chinese steel, like Turkey, much more active into the European and the UK markets. So again, it's all probably slightly out of date now, but you can basically see. I think the main thing with this graph here is if you look at August, the kind of dark blue line, it just shoots up massively, so really, really high, and it's just stayed at that elevated level. So everyone's just awash with steel. At the same time, obviously, demand everywhere is quite low for all of the things that you've briefly touched upon because of the interest rate environment, projects being postponed, cancelled. There's even, steel service centres that I speak to in Europe, people who were ordering new slitting or new decoiling capacity. They're either postponing or cancelling orders at the moment because the market's just not there. And I think people are, as Steve kind of gracefully alluded to, people have basically written off the year. That people just don't see the market improving, and certainly in the conversations that we're having. So I did these slides a while ago now, so I'm just checking what they represent. So again, this just touches on the fact that Asia's exporting so much. You can clearly see it in the import figures, particularly for Europe. The UK has been a bit weird recently because of all of the stuff with Tata closing production. You obviously had a lot of a lot of other countries stuff clearing into the UK, which was predominantly Indian. For some reason, it seems to have stopped. I don't really know why, but certainly from the import data that we see, there's not as much steel is being cleared at the moment, but I think that's due to quota uncertainty, whether the hot roll quota is going to be suspended, when it will be suspended, when it will come back, what the quota will be when it comes back for other countries. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the UK with regards to quotas, but there is just this, there's so much steel in the system, and it's not, I mean, I'm focusing on hot rolled, but it's all, you know, it's all products really. And if you think about flat products, the market share of imports for cold rolled and galv into the EU is like 30-40%, like pretty consistently. So European producers have just lost market share because they have these carbon prices that obviously others don't have to bear. We had the energy cost spike, which has obviously receded now, but it couldn't, you know, if you were in India and you still had access to Russian energy, you had a big cost advantage over Europeans. So European mills and obviously UK mills have just been smashed for the last year plus. Obviously, you've had, you know, those brief cycles where the price has spiked, like after COVID and then in response to the invasion. But in the background, the underlying fundamentals haven't actually really changed that much. So what happens is when people come into the market and they buy a lot, like they did in, like, you know, when Russia invaded Ukraine, or when we've seen these like brief restocking cycles, like we did, I guess, over in 2023. It was probably December of 22 to February or March of 23. People bought, and they bought quite a lot of tonnage, but there was no real change in the demand environment. So then everyone just exits the market all at once, and you have these periods. I think last year, certainly in Europe on hot rolled, it was quite busy, January to March. We were capturing more deals, you know, there was more activity, and then literally from March to November, it was super quiet, and the price just gradually fell every week or every month. And then people came back, kind of started to buy a bit around November or December time of last year. By February, that had fizzled, and it's just gone super quiet again. You had this probably a week or two of restocking in March, this March, where Arcelor started to announce price increases. People were thinking, oh, the price can't go any lower. The import price had gone up, probably helped by currency at the time. So there was this kind of push to get prices higher. That did spark some activity, some restocking, but it's just finished so quickly. So it was probably, you know, whereas the restocking cycles that we've been seeing in the last few years have been 2 or 3 months, it was like less than a month. It was 2 or 3 weeks, then it was done. Everyone's back to destocking. I guess the one good thing is the cycles are getting shorter. So the destocking cycle, which you're seeing at the moment, is probably not going to last as long as it would have, you know, a few years back, because there's a bit less stock in the system because of the interest rate environment. Everyone's kind of got less material. Everything's a bit more hand to mouth. So you're not going to get that prolonged destock that we have seen. And just touching on this, so this is the largest importers into the EU. The big change, obviously, in recent years is that Russia and the Ukraine have fallen away, and then the Asians have come in big time. The other interesting thing is that Turkey, because it's turned from a net exporter to a net importer of steel, mainly because of all the stuff it's taken from China, hasn't really been able to compete into the EU market. It's kind of changing at the moment. The last few weeks, I think you've seen a spate of sales from integrated and EAF-based mills in Turkey into the UK and into the EU as well, because they're hungry for tons. But on the whole, they've not been able to compete because Vietnam has access to, you know, cheap Chinese substrate. So what's happening is Vietnamese production is just being displaced, and that's being sold into the EU, into the UK. I can't remember when when Vietnam started to sell into the UK. It wasn't very long ago. It was, does anyone know? It was
about like 3 years. 3 years.
yeah.
Galvanised.
No, hot rolled.
No, 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was like back end. I think it was summer of last year. Maybe it started, because it's exempt from the, or was, probably won't be, is exempt from the quotas. But you've just basically seen this, you know, real diversion of tonnage from Asia into any other markets that you can go to. And today, I was just mentioning before, there's talk of Australian hot roll being offered into the EU and into Turkey quite cheap. It happens every now and again, not very frequently. But again, Australia is just being, you know, absorbing so much tons from Asia and China that everyone else is having to find market share elsewhere. And this basically shows the displacement of domestic material by imports of hot rolled into the EU. So you can see the light blue line is the import share. And you can kind of see there's like this synergy. So, you know, when I showed that graph of Chinese exports going up, it's like here in August, and you can just see that the import share into Europe is increasing massively at the expense of domestic mills who can't really compete, and they are, as much as they're not really idling, you know, you're not getting these big, we're idling a blast furnace announcement from Arcelor or others. Everyone is kind of managing capacity. You know, people aren't really producing as much as they were, trying to sustain kind of, you know, supply and demand. Realistically, if the hot roll price is going to hold in the coming months with demand where it is, you probably need to see more capacity go offline. You need to see more active production cuts at blast furnaces, this kind of thing. I've messed this up because I've left the date axis off, but I think this is quarterly imports into the EU going back to, I think, 2020. But basically the interesting thing is, so the dark line represents the difference between the domestic Italian price for hot roll coil and the imported price. So what you can see is, as the kind of, you know, as the difference between imports and the domestic price falls, imports fall, and as the difference goes up, imports go up. It's quite logical, but it just shows that the amount of import pressure that Europe is seeing, predominantly from Asia at the moment, and this just showing that spread. So you can see that, you know, the CIF Italy price, the import price for hot rolled, has been quite far below the domestic price. This is actually reverted now, so they're quite close. I think our Italian index is probably something like 640 euros, and CIF is 590. I should know, but it's like there's a gap. There's a gap that's workable probably, but there's a lot of uncertainty over, you know, what the safeguard's going to look like. Obviously, it's being reviewed in the EU as it is in the UK. So you're likely to see potential changes to the safeguard from July in the EU. There's talk of Vietnam getting its own quota, talk of Japan getting its own quota. The big problem there is all of the previous revisions that we've seen to quota volumes of steel into the EU, I think, have been based on the investigation period that was initially used. So that was 2015 to 2017. That was how all volumes have been worked out. But if you were to give Japan its quota, a country quota for hot rolled in the EU on 2015 to 2017, it would be dramatically different to what volumes have been in the last year or two. So it remains to be seen how the Commission gets around that. Obviously in the UK, what will happen with the quotas for hot rolled? You know, Tata's talking about obviously bringing in hot rolled and slab. For the hot strip mill to be profitable, at Port Talbot they need to roll 1.5 million tonnes of slab a year. So let's say they want to maintain The EAF is going to have 3 million tonne capacity. So realistically, you're going to get 2.7, 2.8 million tonnes out of it. So Tata's goal is to import 1.5 million tonnes of slab and import maybe 1.2, 1.3 million tonnes of hot rolled coil. The quota for other countries' steel in the UK, something like 23,000 tonnes a quarter. So it needs to be obviously massively changed. While I'm on Tata, one thing I've found quite surprising about, I'm not talking about the slide, but one thing I've found surprising about Tata is they're talking about investing 1.2 billion to change their production. I don't know if anyone noticed, but they're not actually changing their hot strip mill. So you've got a hot strip mill that was built in 1952, which is the strip mill that's still there. So what they're going to do is replace their blast furnace or their blast furnaces with one large EAF. Obviously, I think new casting capacity, but it's going to feed the existing strip mill, and that to me it's not really the way that I would have approached decarbonising my steel mill, because you've still got very old kit, and it's not going to work properly, in my view. I think what would have been better is if the company and the government had maybe taken a slightly longer view. The government had given them more money. Tata had invested more money, and they could have gone to, like a continuous strip processing line or something that was more modern, more future-proof and less likely to break. Because what they've essentially done, or what they are going to do, is invest 1.2 billion to become basically a Turkish steel mill. There's not going to be any difference between a Tata and Habash or a Çolak. I think the product range is probably broadly similar, and so they're still going to have these issues of how they can compete in the global market. This just shows the spread for hot rolled coil. So the selling price for North European hot rolled coil over blast furnace raw materials, and this is like we've kind of weighted it, so it's 1.5 tons of iron ore, probably 0.6 or 0.7 tons of coking coal, and then maybe 0.2 tons of scrap, I guess. But you can just basically see that the spreads from these kind of ED levels that we saw, they've come right down. This is out of date now. It's lower than this, so it's like maybe 250. And with all of the money that mills need to invest in decarbonisation, in kind of in their plants, $250 spread doesn't actually give you any margin, because that's purely based on the raw material. That's not energy cost, it's not carbon cost, not any of your labour costs. So mills aren't making any money. It's very difficult to invest in your operations when you've got no money, unless the state gives you loads, obviously. And I think this touches briefly on demand. I don't want to labour demand too much because everyone knows how bad it is. But I think one of the big things for the European market, definitely one of the big things for the European market is how bad the German economy is. Obviously, it's in recession. This basically shows, so you can see this is general manufacturing inventory. It's not steel inventory. So you can see that inventory's gone up, and new orders have just slumped. This is according to IFO data, and it looks like a fish as well, swimming backwards, which I find interesting because I'm weird. But yeah, the German economy is screwed. The kind of economic model was, I'm simplifying obviously, but it was take in cheap Russian energy, make value-added product, sell it to China. The Chinese kind of moved towards a consumer-driven economy, away from an investment economy. It's obviously failed. So Germany doesn't really have the Chinese market. It doesn't have the cheap Russian energy. So it's in a difficult position. And then if you think about just steel, goods that contain steel, like cars, whatever, there's also been this big trend because the Chinese economy is where it is, because demand has been quite difficult despite the huge amounts of savings that they've got in China. they're exporting a lot more steel-intensive goods. So if you look at, Chinese exports of electric vehicles or whatever it may be, there's a lot more of them being exported, and some of it goes to Europe. So you kind of got this, two-way issue of steel exports from Asia, steel-intensive goods exports from Asia, and European suppliers can't really compete. And the demand environment, obviously, with interest rates, all of that kind of stuff, is pretty lame. And this, again, just shows that, so you've got the dark line, which is the kind of threshold for, or neutral, basically, the line between growth and deceleration. And you can see that manufacturing and construction in the EU have just been shrinking for like over a year. And interestingly, if you were to look at the manufacturing PMI for Germany versus the manufacturing PMI for Italy and Spain, typically everyone thinks that Germany is, it's the powerhouse of the European economy. Manufacturing basically everywhere outside of Germany is much better than it is in Germany, and Germany is dragging the whole Eurozone down. But when it is such a big
steel and a big producer of steel, it's it's a fairly big issue. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Lucky enough to get on a boat, I believe, so that's a rarity. Today Ian just asked me to come give a little bit of information about who we are, what we do, and also just touch on any customs, good to knows or updates that are ongoing at the moment. I thought I might be after you guys, so I've got a little bit of CBAM, but I'll skip over the majority of it. It's more just from a customs agent side, what I believe might be detrimental to the industry, more in relation to indirect representative and who may be responsible for those. So just to let you know, you see CBAM, I'm not going too far into that, that's your job.
Just say it's terrible.
So moving on, we are part of the PR Ports Group. On that slide, obviously we're all based in the North West at the minute. So we've got Runcorn, Ellesmere Port, Liverpool, which you've seen this morning, and Birkenhead, and then we've got a Railroad terminal in Haitian. To complement those, we've got a terminal in Dublin, Clyde Port, our newest acquisition was last year over in Humber, so we're now present on the East Coast, and we've got Great Yarmouth and London Medway. I'm not sure if any of you all ship into there, but you may know my colleagues from there. So who PR Ports Logistics are, we were purchased, we used to be called Quality Freight Group, if any of you knew those. PR Ports acquired that company, brought us in, and we are the logistics arm to support our group operation terminals. We do ships chartering, agency, customs, transport, project cargoes, customs clearance is my baby in the form of transport. There you go. Sad. It must be sad. So we were brought into the group just to kind of complement the port operations and the services there. There's a customs update, so I know Ian touched on it earlier. Some of you may be involved with the steel safeguard and DTY issues, and NAS have kindly picked up this, trying to rally together a group, and have written to HMRC and met with some ministers. Ideally to see if they would take it on a combined collective basis so that we can use the evidence together. From what I'm hearing, they want to treat it on a case-by-case basis, and that's their stance. I am trying to work together with NAS. Some of you may have seen the evidence document that we've compiled together. it seems to be falling on deaf ears is what my opinion personally is. I feel like we do have a strong case for their arguments back, but some of the review outcomes don't really take into consideration the evidence that we've provided, so there's still ongoing battles there. I'm yet to hear of a positive case. I don't know whether you have to date.
I haven't heard anything positive come back from HMRC other than they are talking to the Department of Business and Trade and they're still waiting for an answer from government. That is the prime route that we think we're going to get some traction on, because HMRC are just saying it's compliant.
Yeah.
They are just going down the compliance route.
They're taking a black and white approach, but I think at ministerial level there is evidence that the industry, so yourself and Steel Trades Association, has combined together to prove that over 90% of the cases were a no loss. So whether it came in quarter one, but by quarter four there was still sufficient tonnage. So whether the period closed or not and it rolled over, there's actually the meaning of steel safeguarding duty and what that is. There has been no loss, and that can be proven. So therefore, the charges shouldn't stand because it's not steel safeguarding duty. They have confirmed it's not a fine, it's not a tax, it's steel safeguarding duty. So from our argument is, if you prove that there was no loss to the industry, as a domestic market, then there shouldn't be any fines there, and steel safeguarding duty applies. But currently falling on deaf ears. That's my experience personally.
The underlying theme on that is make sure it's right the first time.
Yeah.
Which I know you're going to talk about.
Yeah, CDS exports is the next one. So DTY is a problem, but CDS is a new customs declaration system. So if any of you have got anything to do with customs, last year you moved on for imports. If any of you do exports, that's soon going to be approaching you, if not already. Some people moved over by March, or before that if they were on the trial. March, some people moved over, but there's actually quite a staggering amount reported back from HMRC that traders have not moved over, and the deadline is going to be in June. So if you haven't already moved over, or I would check with your agents, have they moved over to CVS exports, if you do any exports. So CBAN, these gents will give you all of the lovely information, but it's going to be under consultation with the government, and it will end, it began in March, it will end on the 13th of June. We should have a lot bit more clarity then after the consultation ends. From my side, what I hear, and it's going to be dissimilar, similar and dissimilar from the EU. So EU it's kind of done at the border, whereas ours, they're saying that they're going to discuss it more of a tax basis, and also our commodities don't align in terms of that they've got electricity, we're slightly different. From my point of view as a trader, what the evidence, or what I would ask you to go and look into is, if you have, are you established in the UK? So everyone's got an EORI and everyone thinks, oh, well, UK established, well, fine. There's a lot of companies that it's coming apparent, coming to light now if you dig deep, that they're not UK established. So you may think that signing a direct representation form and giving it to your agent is sufficient, but actually it's null and void. So the agent would be acting on an indirect representation basis. The difference between those is a direct rep is your customs agent acts on your behalf, you're liable for the information provided. An indirect representation is that the customs agent's jointly and severally liable. What the government is saying is, if you're not UK established, you can't prove that you are UK established. You have to find an agent that's on an indirect rep basis, and that's extremely difficult. And the reasons it's extremely difficult is because the agent then becomes jointly and severally liable. If you've got customs debt for 3 years, you've also got up back to that, it's about 4 or 7 years. So that agent is exposed at an astronomical risk for very, very little reward. If you think of a normal customs declaration, it's maybe like between £60, £80 maybe for a declaration. You wouldn't want to take that, even if you've doubled it or quadrupled it. The risk that you take for that outstanding VAT for those periods, or any duty that comes applicable, the risk and reward, there's just no balance at all. And further to that, you cannot get really insurance to cover that as an agent either. You can find insurance, but the deductibles mean you still outweighed the risk and reward. So if you are non-established, it's something that I would start looking into now. Is there a way that you can become established? If anyone wants the rules surrounding HMRC, if you go on gov.uk and example, established within the UK. Am I established? You type that into Google, HMRC, it will come up with a list as to how they deem you are established. It's not exactly black and white either, so if you believe that you can be classed as established through contracts, etc., on extendable leases or staff that you've got in there, I will challenge HMRC on that as well. But I would say don't bury your head in the sand. I know a lot of people are burying their heads currently and thinking we've got a direct rep, our agent isn't questioning it. This is going to make agents start questioning it, because either your tax representative is going to be responsible or the customs agent, which I'm not 100% sure on the avenue at the moment. But as if you're not UK established, the government is going to want someone to hold responsible for those. So that's something that I would really, really suggest if you aren't established in the UK or you're unsure, please go and look into it, because it is going to affect not just CBAM but your customs declarations moving forward. The more agents open their eyes, customs agents, and start looking into customs, the more this is going to become to the forefront. And I think the better prepared you are, it's going to be better for the whole industry. So yeah, in terms of CBAM, the only other thing I'd say is I'm part of the JCCC, so it's a Joint Customs Committee group that report into policy group at HMRC. We liaise with the government, and a couple of things that are already being brought up is, we are all about sustainability and environmental friendly, but then CBAM affecting the steel industry. Steel making bottles, someone said, well, actually one of our customers, we make steel metal bottles for them, and now they're saying, well, we'll just go back to plastic. So it's things like analyse your customers, know what they use your products for. Are you at risk? Is there any threats, or is there any opportunities that can be taken via CBAM? If you believe that you're going to face a threat because of CBAM, but actually then, on the other hand, the steel and plastic, it's not sustainable, but that's what the government are pushing for. So if you're going to detriment sustainability on one hand because of CBAM, then this is something that needs to be brought to the government's attention. Granted, we won't have a lot of information until the consultation is completed, but it's something that I would start doing now. Investigate your customers, know what they do, and know, are you at risk? And if you are at risk, on the other hand, all the product that they're going to use, does that support our net zero goal or carbon friendly? If not, that's a legitimate argument to be bringing up and push forward to the government to change part of CBAM. I mean, until we have full consultation, we're not really going to know the effects. But it's something that I would push to start looking into, and don't wait. Other changes, it may affect some of you in here, but if you're like chartering your own vessels or you're responsible, so E&S, we're currently anything outside or rest of world, you have to report into Border Force for vessels. It's the carrier's responsibility, but I know some people in the steel industry do arrange their own chartering, etc. It's just something that you need to be made aware of, that now vessels coming from the EU will also be responsible for submitting a safety and security declaration after the 31st of October. It doesn't touch a lot of you, but I know for some of you it may affect, but just something to be aware of, that will also be required. Customs entry statuses. So currently on CDS, I've sent a couple of emails out to some people, and I did put something on LinkedIn as well. Well, on CDS, there's a status for your entry, so I would say to your customs agent, can you please keep an eye on it, and also your compliance departments. If they receive an entry that says customs released, but not customs cleared or customs completed, then to go back and ask for the customs completed document. We don't want to be in a DTY issue now, in 3 years' time. The reason is, customs released, your stuff can go from the port, and you may think, oh, that's brilliant, that's what I want, job's good. But it's not until it's customs completed. Until you've got the customs clear, the customs completed statement, the financial element hasn't been taken. And when we've confirmed with HMRC, there's actually a delay on the quota being applied in some of those instances. So you want to make sure that when your customs agent is actually submitting your declaration, the compliance team are actually checking that the declaration states it's customs completed. Customs released is fine, but you want to be chasing up within the next 24 hours to making sure that that status has changed to completed. And that's it. Everything from me. Any questions?
be responsible to have to register and have to file reports for emissions. More importantly is that by 2027, you will need to pay. If you are not the importer of record and you're the producer, your EU buyer will require you to give you that information. Lauren spoke about it. I'll speak about it right now. If you're using somebody as a broker to be your importer of record, like she said, you have to ask yourself, is my direct representation actually valid? 99% of the time it isn't. Since Brexit is very, very hard to be established in the EU, to get indirect representation, like Lauren says, it's very, very expensive. EY does do it. We charge a gazillion dollars, I'm not exaggerating. Like, basically, we make you take a bond, right? Because, like Lauren says, the insurance doesn't cover it. And we definitely don't charge 60 per and 80 per declaration when it comes to these type of issues. The reason why it's important is because if your broker is doing it on your behalf and then subsequently finds out that, hey, actually, we're doing this under indirect representation, they're going to come back to you and guys like, hey, we need to renegotiate our terms, and the cost is going to go up. And that might be a disruption to your business, because if you can't clear it, you're going to have to ask your client to clear it. And that's going to have an impact on your terms and conditions. And more importantly, they're going to be like, wait a minute, why am I absorbing this cost, right? So that's the big thing. One of the key issues is that the threshold is very, very low. I'll go into the UK afterwards, but the threshold for the EU is 150 euros of consignment. So basically, if you do export to the EU and you're the importer of record, you are basically in scope. The HS codes, there's 600 to 700 that is in an Excel spreadsheet. If you want the link, we can send it. I'm sure Emmanuel, Lauren can help you with that, especially from a customs clearance perspective. If you're in scope, you have to think to yourself, one, am I compliant? Most likely you're not. Just to give you an example, in Germany, you know how the Germans love regulation? Only 11% of people identified by the German Zoll actually register for CBAM. So a lot of people are being non-compliant because there's no fees yet. And the timeline is that from 2025, technically each jurisdiction can decide to block your goods. So this is where you do need to understand that there is a possibility they might block your goods from crossing the border if you're not registered for CBAM and not doing these declarations, right? That's a business imperative. That's not like, oh, compliance, legal, that's a business imperative. To give you an idea how crazy they could be, and I'm not saying it's going to happen right away. The Germans I spoke to, they said there's no way they're going to do that and fuck their industry. The French, or being French, they said they would do it. We'll see. In Spain, for plastic packaging tax, which our group deals with, plastic packaging tax in Spain, when you do a customs declaration, you have to tick a box. There's a box that says it's subject to PPT because it's at risk depending on your HS code. Plastic packaging tax is absolutely nothing. It's 0.05 euro per kg. However, 6 incorrect non-residents, this is a real use case that we were brought into, 6 of them were used incorrectly by the customs declarant, not obviously a good broker, that's just, you know, the client doing that. They used it in the, basically saying, hey, they're the importer of record. They were not registered for PPT because the HS codes were at risk. They could not put those goods over the border. We had to register them so it could go over the border and then deregister them. For PPT, very, very simple. For CBAM, that may be a huge issue. The other problem is, legally speaking, from just a regulatory standpoint, each time you're non-compliant for CBAM, technically that's a strike against your customs URI license. You have enough strikes, they could take it away. Will they take it away right away in the transition period? I don't think so. But that is where we're at. Transitional phase timeline, I'll let Emmanuel go into it, but the main thing you need to understand is 2025 is the big date of like, hey, you need to be compliant, because if you're not, they might start blocking your goods by jurisdiction. It's completely up to the jurisdictions, right? It's not the EC Commission as a whole. The reporting calculations, that's really important because right now we can use default values, which is basically you take weight times a certain rate. Let's say China is 2.1, Taiwan's 2.2, et cetera, Russia's actually great. If there were no sanctions, they'd be very advantageous. But the issue is that afterwards from July, you actually have to have real emissions or emissions using a calculation method that's continuously monitoring. It's very, very complicated. I'll let Emmanuel talk about it. It's not something you want to do, but you have to supply that information to your customers if they need to report it, right? So that's really, really important. Deadlines, I'll let Emmanuel talk about it. Potential cost. So like I said, cost starts in 2027. The good news is there's a freaking free allocation, which is this line here. Free allocation is basically an exemption. So from 2026, there's an exemption, so you're not really paying anything. So really 2027 is when the first time you start to pay. However, by 2030, it gets pretty impactful. By 2034, there's no more actual free allocation. So potentially, and we modeled this, so currently it's about 80 euros or 100 euros, depending on the month, the cost of a CBAM certificate on the ETS, which is the emissions trading scheme in the EU. So I don't know why they want to make this so complicated, but basically instead of just paying a tax, you have to buy these certificates, and when you declare your emissions, you actually use it to release your goods, right? It's like futures, like stock trading. The cost is, let's say, 100. We baked in 5% change each year. So when you bring down the free allocation, there will be a 17% cost as directly as CBAM that you have to release to actually be able to trade these goods into the EU by 2030. By 2034, it might be as high as 42%. I mean, we just had a big presentation on actual margins and costs. This, either you have to pass it on or you have to find another supply chain, right? So this is not something that's theoretical. This is in legislation. It has been modeled. We've modeled it for several of our big clients, including the biggest player in the UK and in Vietnam, and they have to think about it. So that's what I'm trying to say to you guys. This is not something theoretical, and the UK will have a similar graph. I'll explain later. It's much less complicated, but the key thing is that this is an impact on cost eventually. The good news, you have a lot of time to actually plan, because like I said, until basically 2028, 2029, the cost is pretty low. And you might get lucky, they might delay it, but you don't know. So that's something you have to consider on your risk profile and your modelization when it comes to pricing. Yeah, I'll let Emmanuel talk about this, very, very complicated about emissions data, et cetera, reporting. Conscious of time, let's get to the nitty gritty of UK CBAM. So Lauren, like she said, is in consultation, but luckily EY is part of the groups that are working on the legislation and the the kind of like information events. So there's been 4 official HMRC events with HMT, Trade, Treasury, Policy, something, whatever, and they kind of explain what it was. Like Lauren said, it's going to work like a tax. The reason why it's going to work like a tax, because of the Windsor Agreement and Northern Ireland. Because if you put a tariff, and I won't get into the politics of it, but CBAM is a tariff, right, in the EU. It works like a tariff. It smells like a tariff. In the UK, they're going to treat it like a tax so they don't have to go through the Windsor Agreement, right? And it's a national UK tax. The scope is iron and steel, aluminum, cement, hydrogen, fertilizer, ceramics, and glass. There's a bit of like non-ferrous and all that kind of distinction that will come. But the key thing that you will see, no electricity, right? Why no electricity? Because of stakeholding. So NAS, you should be thinking about what should be in iron and steel, which HS codes, should there be credits for it, should there be grants, should there be incentives, should there be exports for relief, right? Very easy mechanisms of how to encourage this very important part of the economy, and more importantly, big labor pool. So one of the key things, they said they want to align with the UK ETS, which already exists. They also want to use emission scoping. So not to get too, Emmanuel will go into it. So if in your organization you already have emissions calculations, most likely you have something called Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, right? It's something considered as greenhouse emissions. CBAM is not calculated like that at all. They have their own methodology. The UK will have its own methodology and will even be more annoying than the EU because they said they would consider precursors, right? So just to break that in for you guys. So precursors is going into finished goods, right? Technically speaking, CBAM in the EU does not apply on finished goods. The reason why is that under WTO rules, it is illegal for most favored nation, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, in Europe, if let's say you wanted to stop BYD to come in the market and basically screw over every car manufacturer and take over the market, you couldn't do that because it's illegal. You can't just put that. But what you can do, like the US is doing, is you can say every Chinese electric battery has a 100% tariff, which the US and Biden has announced. But ironically, is still cheaper than getting US batteries. So that's the kind of stuff that we're looking at, right, from an economic perspective. Everything is about cash, right, at the end of the day. The threshold, the good news for the UK, the threshold is £10,000 of value of UK CBAM. So we did a quick exercise at EY using publicly available information, which is one of the great things about HMRC. So HMRC has something called MSS data. That means they have each of your export and imports that have been declared through the year. You guys can get that for 100 to 200 pounds per year. They give you that report. There's something called the HMRC Trader Portal. And that information says what type of HS codes you're importing or exporting from. In the UK, today, if we were to use the proposed HS codes, there is 44,000 traders that would have to register for UK CBAM. So it's a huge number, very big impact, very, very annoying. So you have to think about that because it's supposed to go live in 2027. In the projected budget for 2028, they expect it to raise 300 million pounds from CBAM alone. To give you an idea, the EU is not even thinking about that before 2030. The reason why the UK wants to put in this rate, so the UK doesn't have certificates, it's just a tax, right? It's like a rate. Why they want to do that is because they want you to pay from 2027, so the EU can't charge their CBAM on you. Because the EU, in its legislation, says that any carbon tax that's paid in another jurisdiction that is harmonious equivalent can be deducted. So that means the UK is like, you're paying me, you're not paying the EU. So that's why it's very important to think about this, because there's no way that this is getting delayed. I spoke to Mike over there. In general, right, we expect, obviously, I assume Labour is going to win. I assume. Who knows? But if any government in 2027 will be focused on three things: the economy, jobs, and you can't do that through taxes, right? Because taxes are too high. And everybody's promising that they won't raise taxes or they'll give breaks. What's the easiest thing? Industrial / virtuous taxes, right? So UK CBAM, UK EPR, UK PPT is also being reformed to be more expensive. There's UK deforestation that's going to make the EU deforestation that's coming live in 2025. So it's a plethora of that. Couple of things. Registration will be similar through Gateway. So you use Gateway to your VAT, your normal corporate tax payee. You're going to do that. It's going to be similar. You're going to be able to be a tax agent. So you can go see Lauren. She can be your third party and do all of that directly. The rate will be set depending on the consultations. The emissions, like I said, will be more complicated in the EU, but they will have a default rate in the beginning. Very quickly, here's the summary table. You can read this at your leisure. These are the differences between the two. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I would say that the easiest thing to compare this to in the UK is VAT and customs. It's very, very similar as a mechanism. So that's enough for me. I will leave it to Emanuele. Any questions before or comments before I pass it on?
So I've tried to be quick. So thank you. That's really interesting. You covered all the difficult bits, so I can actually now do something narrow and deep. Thank you for having us. My name is Emmanuel Janquit. I represent Chamber Customs. Chamber Customs is a company fully owned by the British Chamber of Commerce. So we work in synergy with the BCC. We are owned by them. The BCC represents about 100,000 businesses in the UK. And what we do is lobbying or stakeholding on behalf of our members. So we are very often in Whitehall discussing problems that the trade has with the relevant people and trying to influence policy, a bit like we are a membership organization like NAS. We've been doing international trade for over 100 years, doing certificate of origins and a lot of interesting things that I'm sure we could discuss over forever, yes, because we are like that. Now, as in the lead up to Brexit and in discussion with HMRC, there was a clear gap in customs brokerage identified in the UK. Who's going to do all the custom clearances for, all these new things that now we have to import from Europe that before didn't need paperwork and now they do? And so we decided to create Chamber Customs, and I was tasked with that project. So we introduced that, and we serve members and non-members through a network of chambers around the country. So now the operation is 4 years old, and the operation has been handed over to my colleague Mitch Perks. He represents us at the JCCC, and I can do interesting and different things like coming up here and going on a cargo ship, which was very interesting. Thank you very much. So what we also do is consultancy. So we get traders, and you have identified a lot of the scenarios that we get. We help them from a one single query that takes 30 minutes to a full consultancy project. That's what we do. We help people, or we go and train them, or a combination of the two. We also do customs agency, but for a variety of traders. We don't just concentrate on the steel industry, and we don't lift and shift. So our focus is compliance. And when CBAM came in, we basically were asked by members and customers, what is it? How does it affect me? Why should I know about it? And can you help us? And so we thought that we would. So I'll go, I just want to concentrate on the EU CBAM and specifically what it means for third-party operators. We are third-party or third-country operators. We are not in the EU. I hope you noticed that, but yeah. So the CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that Danny has probably lived and breathed for the last however many years. It applies to carbon-intensive goods, as you very nicely explained. And yes, it prices the carbon emitted during production. The idea is to tax that carbon. And it's done on a differential basis. So if your production is less green than Europe, that's where you pay money. So the idea is to push the whole industry to become greener. How they want to do it? By affecting what matters the most, which is the bottom line, which is what we were discussing at lunch earlier. So that's how it works. Now, there is a UK CBAM. You explained it very well. All the other CBAMs are coming up because eventually what the other countries don't want is that the EU taxes. If nobody has taxed beforehand, the EU will tax. So guess what? Everybody else will tax as well. I won't go into that because you explained it incredibly well. So what's in scope in the EU CBAM, right? Iron and steel, aluminium, you have fertilizers, you have hydrogen, and of course, cement. So that's the scope of products that European importers will have to report on. So very briefly, I'm not going to go into too much because realistically, for us in the UK, in terms of EU CBAM, there are only a few things that we're interested in. We are currently in what's called a transitional period. So the EU is collecting data to understand, right? Because frankly, this is new. So it's all, written in theory, but they don't know if it's going to work. So they're collecting data, and it's only later in 2026 that you will start being charged. And when I say you, I don't mean you. I mean your European customers will start to be charged when they import products in scope. Until now, until the end of July, they don't even need your information. Your European customers can use default values. Apply the multiplying factor, it's done. They don't need to know. But actually, after that, they will need information. So they will want to know from you or from your customers how much carbon was used to create or process the product that they're importing, which seems like an easy question, but it's not. Now, for me, this is the one thing that you need to take home with you. As the UK exporter, your responsibility is to provide figures. Please, Danny, shout if I'm saying something wrong. UK companies do not need to register for the EU CBAM unless you are established in the EU, unless you operate in the EU, and you are the importer of record in the EU. Is anybody an importer of record in the EU through through a sister company, or if you have like a branch in the EU? So that's all you have to do. You might need to provide figures to your clients. And to me, that's the main point to demystify, because a lot of companies that call us up are asking, how do I register for the EU CBAM? Well, you don't need to. Now, as you explain, so if you are the EU importer, you need to submit the report and you have a legal responsibility. You can be fined by the EU, but if you're not the EU importer of record and you are the UK exporter, the only responsibility that you have is what I've called the commercial, you call the business, same concept. You don't want to lose your customer, you want to provide the information that they need, but actually you are not going to be fined by anybody, because you are not in scope of this regulation. As we heard before, this is based, CBAM works on certain common nomenclature codes or harmonized system codes, and it really takes into account what they're defining as production routes. The value that we're going to use is tons of CO2 equivalent in the steel industry, and it's not like what we're doing now. It's not enough to know as an installation how much CO2 you produce. This is totally different. Why didn't they keep it simple? I don't know, but it's actually going down to the individual product that you're creating, and that makes life hard. So what do you actually have to report? And this is what I wanted to cover. So the first concept that you need to ask, the first question you need to ask yourself, are you a producer or are you a processing plant? Now, if you are a producer, I'm not going to teach you how to make steel, because I think you know a lot more than I've managed to read upon. But if you are producing steel, if you're a primary manufacturer, then you have hot furnaces burning and you have direct emissions that you contribute to the environment, because you're burning something to create heat and do all the beautiful processes that you know very well about. How many of you produce steel in hot furnaces in this room? You do, great. So that, yeah. So that would be a producer. You would need to track those direct emissions.
Do already.
Fantastic. And it's not as a full plant, but it goes down to each of the routes of production. So if you have like 2 furnaces, and one is older and dirty, and one is newer and greener, in theory, you should be able to differentiate the product that comes from route A and the product that comes from route B, because they have a different weight in terms of the carbon that was used.
Can you take the values from the EPD?
Well,
Not specific enough.
it's not considered specific, but if you don't have anything else looking back, then there isn't much you can do about it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, the approach that we are using is like, use this tool as a continual improvement This is the first year. You do what you can because you have to actually choose a reporting period, which will come out in a bit. And you can only look back. You cannot look forward. So you take the best that you can. You identify how accurate that information is, and then you make a plan to improve. You can't make this up. Now, the second question, so in terms of processing, you have to consider your indirect emissions. I think maybe that's not as difficult as it sounds. Indirect emission, we might be looking at the electricity used in the processing. So I had a client 3 weeks ago, called us in, we went to help. They showed me the shop floor. They have a very simple operation. Their product is in scope, right? So goods in scope, yes, 100%. And what they do is they do tanks. So they import metal sheets, they punch it, they corrugate it, they undulate it, they pack it on a pallet, and they ship it out. It's quite simple, but their customers in Europe are asking for these figures. Now, they will need to do two things. They will need to understand what comes in, and that's challenging. And then they will need to understand what they use in that production process. But for them, it's easy. They only do one product. So it's really easy to apportion. Although they still have to do calculations because will it take more energy if it's thicker? Will it take more energy if it's a specific shape rather than the one that you run on the faster machine? So that's the conversation we're having. Goods in scope is a very important question to ask because, as Danny said, there are hundreds of CN codes on the spreadsheet. Check, because it might be that your customer is asking you and you can reply and saying, maybe they're not. Now, let me put my customs clearance hat on. When is the last time you have reviewed your codes? Because I'm going to speak for you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but customs agents find that very often those codes have not been looked at in years. And, somebody has been using that code because, their fathers have been using that code before them and their fathers before them. Honestly, it's important, and that code might drive whether your product has to be on this reporting list or not. A good time to check if you're still classifying your products correctly. Would you?
Changed, and they've been updated several times since Brexit as well. So we do try and take them legal, but I would definitely say review your codes. There's sometimes tolerances, small differences, but if you look at the description, they've actually changed.
And you are unaware that you are declaring incorrectly, and then you have the DTI issue and people shouting at you. The next point is boundaries and precursors. So you have to do a bit of a mapping exercise and understand what is within your boundaries. So what is stuff that you can count, you can account for directly? What are the processes that are happening under your control? What is to do with the embedded emissions? So when you're bringing products in, and most of the customers I've spoken to bring products in with embedded emissions, well, you need to go and ask. I find that quite interesting that there is a EU piece of regulation and all the searching for the information is pushed to the rest of the supply chain. I find that fascinating. But you need to actually find out what's in and what's out. All this IPR conversation that we were having is something that you need to understand whether it's in the boundary of what you're reporting or not. And the reporting period. Ideally, you would use 12 months. Ideally, you would use a significant period. Personally, I find when I go out to customers, they're using a financial year is very helpful because you actually get information to do with stock, with production, so it's easier, but whatever makes sense to base your calculations on. And then the fun part, you have to do data collection. One of the challenges I've seen with the customers with the customer I was telling you about, they knew sales very well. They could tell me exactly what was sold in a 12-month period, but they couldn't tell me exactly what was processed in a 12-month period. And if you think about it, if I look at the electricity bills, for example, that relates to what's processed, not to what was sold. And with years, in the past where, when demand and supply go up and down, you could have a quiet year where you produce a lot and sell little. So it's challenging. And the other challenge, so that they have a lot of work to do to try and reconstruct this. And the other information that is not always available is, what is each machine using? That can be challenging to find out. So there's a lot of nuances in doing that. And finally, once you have done all that, how are you going to apportion the emissions from each of your production processes to the products you're creating? Now, if you're lucky, like the client I'm telling you about, you have one product, so it's quite easy. But if you produce 300 SKUs, then you have a bit of a challenge on your hands. And there are software solutions out there that can help you. But before you actually, and I would say be careful if you are doing or advising somebody, before you go out and buy an expensive piece of software, do you actually need that? Or are you okay with a simpler approach to actually get to your numbers to provide to your customers? So this is our way, this is how we approach creating a reporting methodology for a customer. You don't need consultancy for that, but we're very happy to provide consultancy for that, as I'm sure that Danny and EY would be as well. It depends on how complex your situation is. The bottom line, back to what we were saying before, back to what you were saying before, you need these for your customers. We have a quick consultancy solution, Allow Me, and the idea is some help to visit your premises, work with your team to understand those points, let you do some data gathering, and then we actually help you producing, that monitoring and reporting approach or methodology. That's what we can help you with, or any of those parts in between. Why should you do it? I like what you said at the end. This is for the EU, but it's a good exercise to do to start thinking in that way and being ahead of the curve for when CBAM comes into the UK as well, for products that we import in the UK. You would already have a structure to collect and understand that information. The benefits of being compliant with CBAM and being able to provide this information is that you could provide your EU customers with the information they need. And if you have this information and others haven't, well, you know what? You have a competitive advantage. Our EU customers already have to go through more red tape and paperwork, having to do import declarations, bringing products in from the UK after Brexit. Maybe we can take some of that hassle out and provide the info they need. There is another thing. You could actually discover that certain production lines, certain processes in your plant are not very green. And that could be a way of attacking that problem, resolving it, creating a product that is cheaper to import in the EU. If that's your market, that would be an interesting point to obtain, an interesting benefit to obtain. And finally, yes, prepare to be compliant with the UK CBAM legislation. So that is my summary in terms of how to create a reporting methodology for your EU customers. Any questions, you can ask me now over the burger, or you can send us an email. Thank you very much.